Greetings, my name is Christopher Paisley. I'm a Philadelphia public school teacher. Today I'd like to share my discussion that I had with Kyle Boyer, who is a school board member of the Tredyffrin Easttown School District. Just to give you some backstory on this, recently I did a video which covered the Tredyffrin Easttown School District's school board meeting on June 14th, where there were a number of parents who spoke at the meeting criticizing the equity initiative. There were about 33 parents who spoke. Half the parents came out in support. Half the parents had questions and criticized and challenged the equity initiative. After the parents spoke, Kyle took the time to kind of give a response. In a way, he said he felt offended at what some of the content and some of the contents, and he had said that some of this stuff was hurtful and harmful. And then he did go on to say that these comments and what he had experienced was he said then he understood why that the Capitol was breached on January 6th, which was definitely a thing that caught my attention. So I did a video about that, and I kind of replayed the comments, or at least I compressed them, and then I gave clips of Kyle's response. And obviously I didn't put the whole thing in there because I wanted to compress it into sound bites, but I tried to capture the voice and the flavor. And then I published the video, and then the next day I got an email from Kyle, and he said, this had gotten back to him. Some people in his circle had saw the video, and they kind of showed it to him, and he reached out to me. He said, hey, I saw the video. Let's have a conversation. It was very civil, and I felt, I appreciated that he reached out to have a conversation. So I said, hey, that's great. Let's kind of do this. And do you mind if we just make an interview of this so we can kind of analyze it and play it on my YouTube channel? And he said, absolutely. So this is our conversation. This is our discussion, specifically about some of the comments he made, but also much more encompassing of, we talk about racism, we talk about microaggressions, the concepts of individualism and group identity, and some other topics. So here is our interview. So just to start, I guess, can you just give some background to the people who watch my channel? It's called Chalk and Talk. I'm not sure how much they know about your background. So if you could just get into, I know you have a really pretty impressive background. You have a lot of different experiences. Could you just go through some of the stuff, some of your credentials and your resume?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for the conversation. It's always better to be able to do this than to have snippets of what you said taken out of context, which I think we discoursed about electronically.
Okay.
But for those who, I guess, outside of what others may have learned from the last video in which I appeared, I'm Kyle Boyer. I'm an educator. I'm a pastor. I am not in a clergy collar for dramatic effect. I literally haven't had a chance to change. I did a funeral today of our oldest member at 102 years old, which was a high honor. Sad occasion, but of course, she lived a wonderful life, and it was more of a joyous affair as, the homegoing celebrations of seniors can often be when they live right. Pastor, teacher, social justice advocate, and that's often where my voice lands, which I think is why we're in this conversation, because of my discourse along those lines. But that's the best description of me. I don't need to go through my academic credentials. People can, Google that, but that is the best way to sort of encapsulate who I am and what I work on.
Okay. So your book, because I see you've written a couple of different books. It looks like your most recent book is called The Prince, the Priests, and the Prophets.
Yeah. The
Need for Prophetic Leadership in America. You want to talk a little bit about that?
In brief, I'm sort of a public theologian, and the book is a work of public theology. It really examines the need, as the subtitle says, for prophetic leadership in America. What do I mean by that? The need for the voice and the voices of those who sort of speak truth to power to be elevated. Now, I will say the book reads a little bit differently in July 2021 than it would have in the last year of President Trump's presidency. But nevertheless, I think a lot of the issues, as we can see from our last school board meeting of the year, a lot of the issues, at least from the perspective of folks in my school of thought, are the same. So, it's part sermon, part history, not as much of my education policy life, but very much my sort of social justice life, theological life, and it merges some of those things into a work of public theology.
Okay. Now, did you run for office? Did I see that you recently ran? Did you run for office recently in the last year or so?
I did. I ran for state senate in the primary. I opted not to get out of the race, and I stayed in and tried to raise some issues. And I'm really glad I did, because since that time, I haven't gotten a break, been able to work on a lot of cool things. So, there are some times when not winning sort of accomplishes what you need to. It wasn't about my voice as much as it was about some of the things I care about. Chief among them, education policy, but also issues of social justice. And I've been able to work on those things to an even greater extent than before when I jumped in the race. So I'm glad that I did. Okay.
Interesting. So you did mention the school board meeting, which I did do the video on from June of this past June. The school board meeting, basically, there were parents, I think there were 33 parents who spoke, and it seemed to break 50-50. Half seemed to support the Tredyffrin Easttown School District's approach to equity and inclusion, and what some people would say is critical race theory, which we're going to talk about because it comes down to semantics of that. And again, some were in support, and then some criticized and challenged it. And then it was interesting, and I was actually kind of impressed in a way that you kind of gave a mini lecture, I guess, as someone who's a pastor. In a way, it was like a sermon to the people in the school board. In the meeting, you kind of chastised them in a way, and you felt that some of the things that they said at the meeting were, I believe you said, hurtful and harmful. And I did do that video. I didn't put the full 16 minutes in there. I compressed it. You reached out to me. You said, hey, it would be nice if it was in context. And I totally understand what you're saying. So just to kind of clarify and give you a chance to say exactly how you felt. When you said that some of the comments were hurtful and harmful, can you be specific? Like which people, whether they were parents or concerned citizens, what they said and why did you feel it was hurtful? Because I watched it and I noticed that some of it was definitely they were criticizing, but I wasn't sure if I would have used the phrase hurtful and harmful, but I'm interested in your perspective.
So if you allow me, just before I give my response, which of course I will, did you watched all of the meeting?
I watched the full 2.5 hours, the whole meeting. I watched it a couple of times because I wanted to get the clips and I needed to compress it into like a 30-minute video. But yes, I watched it.
One thing that I will challenge you to do is maybe also, in addition to this video, in another video, maybe highlight some of the comments that I reference. Let's start right out the top, which I didn't watch your whole video. I watched a lot of it, but I didn't watch the whole thing. Did you pull out Gene Tompkins' comment?
Okay, now I don't know the specific names.
I'll give you a list of timestamps, but right at minute 19 or so, and these of course are approximate within the minute range. I'm sure you understand that, but at about minute 19, the first public commenter, who we've gotten very interesting emails from, and the only reason that I'm speaking in this way is because all of this is public, right? You get up at a public meeting and you speak, and there's video up. You own your words. Normally, I would absolutely. I didn't even call out Patty Benson's name, and we can talk about that later. But after you speak publicly, you own what you say publicly.
Absolutely,
as I do. So Gene Tompkins, Mr. Tompkins, gets up at minute 19, and right off the bat says, there's no such thing as systemic racism. I've never seen. That's what he said. I've never seen it. Never seen it in the military. Never seen it in my work in government. Never seen it in private practice. Haven't seen it in major corporations. Okay, maybe not hurtful, but right there you've got a harmful remark to someone who's sitting in the audience as an African-American member. And granted, I wasn't sitting in the audience. I was sitting at the table. There's a power dynamic. There's a privilege dynamic, if you will, when you're sitting at the table as opposed to the audience. But I was an African-American individual sitting in the audience. And mind you, a lot of what I'll reference, I had a lot of conversations with some of the African-American members who were sitting in the audience and many more who watched it. And it plays differently when you are in a different position. So to many of the African American individuals watching it, for someone to outright dismiss that there's racism is, yes, hurtful and harmful. At minute 25, Mr. Rubenstein, another frequent flyer as it relates to sending us emails and communication, even more so than Mr. Tompkins, quotes, I forget what media source, some conservative media source, which is fine, but you got to scrutinize, who you're citing. LeBron James may be worth $1 billion, but he will always be a voice of the helpless given his race. What does it matter that Al Sharpton was a racist demagogue, that Jesse Jackson, a skilled shakedown artist of corporate America, that Bayard Rustin, in contrast, a brilliant civil rights strategist, or that Martin Luther King, right?
I think I think he was quoting Victor David Hanson. Is that what he was quoting an article from Victor David Hanson? Okay. Yeah, that's right.
That's cool. But to the African American sitting there, and this happens a lot, you're sort of telling us who our exemplars as African Americans should be, right? All of those individuals that he referenced are African Americans. So these are appropriate African Americans. These are not. Minute 28, Miss Earlings, who has sent us some of the more pointed emails, quotes, I believe, Manning Johnson, but after her quote directly correlates Black Lives Matter to bloody racial conflict and Marxism. And I think at this point in our conversations about Black Lives Matter, the mature among us can separate the organization from this sort of movement, that we don't want individuals of color to disproportionately be shot by police, right? There's an organization, but most African-American teenagers, and you teach in Philadelphia, I'm sure you understand this, most African-American teenagers who will get in the street and march in a peaceful march are not marching for an organization, a 501c or C3 or something. They're marching for a cause.
Okay. Could I just, so do you differentiate between like the organization BLM that's more of they have a pack, and then the individual kind of spirit and mantra? Is that, do you see the distinction? Do you believe that
absolutely there has to be a distinction?
And does it frustrate? Do you get frustrated when they're kind of?
I don't get frustrated because the aims of the organization versus someone like me who's a social justice advocate, a pastor, Black individuals, a teacher, Black students, our aims are not so disparate that they're in conflict per se. But I mean, even from just the sort of church perspective, there's some key differences between the mission and objectives and approach of the organization versus the collective body of people who believe that Black lives matter. And to that point, when people say, well, all lives matter, well, it's like when I see someone wearing a ribbon for breast cancer awareness, I don't quickly go and grab one of those puzzle ribbons and say, well, autism awareness matters too. You don't do that, right? Because there's a cause that has to be elevated. There's some sort of grievance or some sort of point of pain or hurt that needs to be addressed in that moment. And just simple humanity, I think it's a good thing as a person to acknowledge someone's hurt and pain and not immediately say, well, I have hurt and pain too. So that's that point.
Okay. Could I just follow up?
Yeah.
I appreciate the specifics, and I remember those specifics. So when you use the phrase hurtful and harmful, do you feel as though you're kind of coming from the position of, people of color, the African American community from that way? Do you think that others in the district would not see that as hurtful and harmful, that it's just simply you're trying to criticize or critique the things that are happening? Can you see how someone would feel that's not what you said? Because you had mentioned that it's some of the worst things. You haven't heard anything like that. Didn't you say you hadn't really heard anything like that in all of your time?
Well, no, that's not what I said.
What specifically did you say?
That's not what I said. I said I've never seen anything like that.
You've never seen anything like that.
If you were sitting where I was sitting, for the first time in my life, I've never seen an audience where, and it literally was about half the audience cheering at someone saying there's no such thing as racism. So for those of us and I will speak for more than just myself, because of the people that I know in the community and who were sitting in the, most of the African American individuals in the audience, I have a personal relationship with, so I can sort of speak from this perspective. For those of us sitting in that audience, that was the most unsafe that I've ever felt in our school district. For the first time in my life, I was actually really happy that we have armed security at one of our school board meetings. You see these visions and documentary clips of sort of racialized incidents where, you know, people are harming people of color or threatening them or spitting in their face or harassing them. I've never really experienced that in person, but that meeting was the closest that I came to feeling that. To your question, Chris, can I see how someone would be offended that I said that? Yeah, absolutely. Because a lot of times when you disagree with folks who unfortunately are on a position that's closer to being bigoted than not, they get mad when you call it out.
Okay. When you said that the one person in the beginning did not agree that there was racism, he was referring to systemic racism. Do you draw the difference between like overt racism, like prejudice and discrimination, things that you would be fearful of in person, like someone who would be overtly racist or bigoted, something that would make you unsafe, and someone who says, in terms of systemic racism, the systems in America, they've never personally come in contact with the kind of systemic racism that people lately have been saying. Like, for example, America was founded on a system that was designed, like specifically designed, the founding of the country was designed to be oppressive, and that it's baked in, the systemic racism is baked in, racism is baked in. When the one gentleman said that he has not experienced this kind of baked in systemic racism, can you see how that will be different than what overt bigotry and overt prejudice and discrimination?
Mr. Tompkins did once use the word systemic in his remarks, but remember, he started with the Freudian slip. I'm against, what did he say? He said, I'm for, whatever he meant. He said the wrong thing. He said something like, I'm for racism, and corrected it after that. He used the word systemic, but based on the data that I also have from his emails, it's not a conversation for him specifically, just about the word systemic. That's not the only thing that it's about for him.
Do you believe that he doesn't? Do you believe that he really doesn't believe that there's racism in America, or is he?
I can't speak for him, but again, he's sent us many emails, so I'm more aware sort of the tenor behind what he said. But you're right, absolutely right. If you want to call the roll, play the tape, he used the word systemic in his remarks. But here's the point, right? As a member of a privileged race, you are not in the position to say that there is or isn't racism. And I don't mean you, I mean Mr. Tompkins. You can't speak to a group of people of color and say there's no racism because, end quote, I haven't seen it. I mean, doesn't that speak to what privilege is?
I'm glad you brought up the idea of privilege, because I do want to talk about that if we have time.
I also want to go back real quick if I can. It's not my interview, but can I go back to something?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you said you challenged the notion that the country was, and I'm not using your exact phrasing, so forgive me, but you challenged the notion that the country was built upon oppression of specific individuals, right?
Designed, like it was designed, like when the founding fathers designed the country, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, when they were written. Was it designed to?
Okay, let's talk Constitution, 1789. What were Black people considered in the Constitution in terms of population?
So you're saying you think it was designed that way?
Can you answer that for me? Huh? Three-fifths of an individual, correct?
Okay.
This isn't made up stuff. It's literally the Constitution of the United States. Black individuals who at that time were all slaves. There were very few free individuals of color in the country in 1789. Agreed? This is history. Agreed?
Sure. I'll agree that it had bugs in the beginning. It definitely had glitches, obviously. There were some mistakes that had to be rectified, big mistakes. But do you believe that the principles, the values and principles behind this experiment were meant as it developed to have this oppression baked into it, as it developed into the 21st
baked
century?
into it? Absolutely.
You believe that?
You don't write a specific group of people based on the color of their skin as 3/5. So line up 5 white individuals in 1789. I don't know if they were all. I was about to list the first 5 presidents, but when they all died, I don't want to be inaccurate. But let's list 5 white individuals, and let's put 5 black individuals next to them. The black individuals, according to the Constitution, Chris, not making this up, according to the Constitution, historical fact, counted as less. The Constitution constituted the nation. So if you're saying that this group of people, simply because of the pigmentation of their skin, are 3/5 of this individual, then yes, that means you're baking in oppression of this particular group.
Okay. Do you think that is still baked in today? Like, would you, through your perspective, the United States of America today, the systems in America, but the country as a whole, do you believe that it's specifically designed today to oppress certain groups?
I think there's some semantics here, and I don't want to get tripped up. So do I think that there are still systems lingering from way back when the country was founded that still oppress people of color specifically? Absolutely. The data bear that out. It's just a simple fact. So let's take our state of Pennsylvania. It's a statistical fact that the greater the population of a school district is, the greater the population of students is of color, the more there is an underfunding of that school district. This has been proven. It's not.
So the disparity in funding, I think I could agree with you that historical racism and the things that you mentioned definitely follow through to the present.
Okay.
I think a whole lot is being done to rectify and level the playing field. I will say this much: disparities, I don't believe that all disparities are the sole result of systemic racism. I don't think that all racial disparities are directly resulting from historical racism or systemic racism. Do you believe that all disparities, like racial disparities, the achievement gap?
You attributed that to Kendi. When did Kendi say all disparities? Because I don't know when he said that.
Yeah, Kendi said that. He said there's 2 principles, all race, I'm paraphrasing, something like all races are the same, or all cultures are equal or the same. And if you believe that a difference in culture is the result of race, then it's racist, because any difference in culture, any disparity in cultures is simply systemic racism. And if you believe otherwise, it means you're a racist. I'm just paraphrasing him saying that.
I mean, my own personal philosophy, having studied it, I'm not going to say that are all disparities everywhere in every county or parish, in the case of Louisiana, are all disparities between races directly linked to race? No, but I think the majority of them are. Majority of the lingering disparities in our country today do have some racial undertones. And what concerns me is the fear of sort of attempting to eradicate disparities. So even if they're not directly related to race, if we find that there's a correlation between race and the disparity, why wouldn't we want to address it?
Okay. I think that's a good point. I think most people want to address it. I know I do. I think it's important to look at patterns and to look at demographic data. But what I am more concerned with are the solutions, because it seems like when you're trying to find the causes, it's like, okay, we can squabble over the causes. And what we've talked about seem to be mostly about the causes. It's important to look at patterns and demographic data. But when you're talking about solving the problems, and this was one of the questions that I wanted to get to, how much do you think, when you're talking about the solutions, how much do you feel we should approach the solutions at a systemic level, more of the identity-based model where we're looking at systems, we're looking at power hierarchies, what you mentioned, oppressor groups, whiteness, white privilege? How much should we be looking at it through that lens of identity and power structure at a systemic level, and how much should we be looking at it in terms of something that I would call an individual level, in terms of just what I would say are principles and values. Now, I know people would argue there's no such thing as a universal principle or value because it's culturally relative. But in terms of helping students, because you were a teacher and now you're a pastor helping people, when you're trying to end disparities and give people, help, how much is individual values, principles, and how much is systemic policy, in your opinion?
Well, firstly, they're not mutually exclusive. I'm still a teacher, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah, among the, I do.
Okay. So do you still teach in Philly? I'm sorry,
I haven't taught in Philly for about 9 years. I teach in Easttown.
Oh, okay.
So you can see, right? I've taught primarily Hispanic students. I've taught primarily African-American students. I teach a mix now. I've taught primarily white students in Tredyffrin Easttown School District and had great experiences all over. But it's both the systemic and the individual. You don't forsake one because of the other. So in my classroom, I would look like an idiot if I stopped working with a particular student and said, you know what, we're not going to help you, pass this math test because I need to go outside and figure out how to address systemic racism. That would be stupid, because within my locus of control in that moment is the individual who's in front of me. And part of my job as a teacher is to work and make a relationship with and connection with and love and appreciate and support that individual. But at the same time, we don't close our eyes to the systemic realities. When we look at the data, and I mean, I'm sure you know something about data. I believe you're a guidance counselor, correct?
I have my counseling cert. I'm an English teacher, but I have my counseling.
I'm sorry. Yes. So we look at data all the time in education, more so than ever post NCLB. And it's kind of like we see these patterns. And if we think that we're going to give subpar education to whole groups of people for literally centuries, and then all of a sudden, now that we passed the law, there's no more systemic problems, I think we're not being true to our critical thinking ability. You know what I mean? I know it's a little bit easier for me to come to this because of what I study and what I read. But when people really stop to think about terms like privilege, once they get over the sort of scariness of it or initial offense, when you really start to peel back the layers and say, you know what, we did start by making these folks 3/5 of a person. And you know what, we really did redline these groups of people into specific communities. And you know what, we really do, disproportionately arrest certain groups of people and things of that nature. When you really start to have like a principled, data-driven conversation about it, it begins to make more sense.
Okay. I think from what you're saying, I kind of agree. There should be a balance between the systemic and the individual. Do you agree there should be a healthy balance between the two of them?
Absolutely. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, and I don't think one negates the other. You don't say because we want to address systemic racism that we stop teaching individual responsibility, or guess what? There's systemic racism, so now a Black individual can go out and commit a crime, and if he commits a crime and is stopped by the cops, he shouldn't be held accountable. No, you don't say that at all. But you also address the greater issue that makes this individual more likely to be stopped for that crime than other individuals.
It's interesting, your perspective, because I think you're seeing, from what I hear, you're seeing that a lot of people are objecting to looking at systemic issues and systemic racism, like the one person you spoke about at that meeting.
I challenge that.
Okay.
Maybe a lot of people nationally, because it is a national effort, which I'm sure you can agree with, right? The fight against CRT, as it's been posited in conservative media, as a nationally organized sort of thing, right? You agree with me on that, right?
Yes. Okay. Could I just finish the second half of what I was just?
I apologize. Yeah,
that's okay.
So the reason I interrupted, I was challenging the notion that it's a lot of people in our school district. It's not a lot of people.
Oh, okay. All right. So thank you for that clarification. So people do, though. It seems to be the issue in terms of some people see that when people challenge systemic issues, they're saying that they want to ignore racism, they want to ignore these systemic things and these patterns. And it seems like on the other end of the spectrum, people feel as though individualism and these kind of personal values and principle-based things are being ignored. And in the media, especially with writers like Robin DiAngelo and in certain cases Kendi, and I don't want to get into the specifics of what they say, I don't have quotes in front of me, but it seems like individualism in a way recently has been under attack in terms of individualism is kind of a mistake because of power structures and power dynamics. People really don't have that much individual agency over their life, and meritocracy and things like that. It seems like people feel that these approaches are under attack, much the same way people may feel that too many Americans are ignoring systemic issues. So it seems like on one end, people are arguing we're ignoring the systemic issues. On the other end, people are saying we're ignoring individualism, principles, values, and the ability to have, agency over your life. And it seems like some of those folks at that school board meeting were coming from that lens of they felt as though individualism and things on that nature were kind of being discounted. And I think that they felt a little bit frustrated about that. Do you kind of see that perspective, or what do you think about that?
I understand that perspective, but I think that it's also laden with fallacies. I mean, even before someone is in a position to make an individual decision, there's a host of things that happen before that. So for instance, I know nothing about your background, Chris, with the exception of your career, sort of an initial Google search. I don't know where you were raised, your reading level when you graduated from high school. I don't know if you came from a two-parent household. I don't know if you have a criminal record. You probably don't, but I don't know the nature of your community. I don't know where you graduated from high school. To say that, every individual starts out at the same place is just to ignore all of the other things that go into someone's development.
I agree. I agree with you on that point. Absolutely. Not to cut you off, but absolutely. My definition of individualism isn't that everybody starts out equally. I just think my definition of individualism is we have more control over our lives at an individual level in terms of our choices and our decisions and our values, what I call values and principles, than we do in terms of trying to influence policy at a systemic level. You can do both. But I think when I help my students, I think the fastest way to success is like you say, when you're working with them as an individual. I'm not saying that if this person gets this far and this person gets this far, it was all about hard work and merit and individualism, because obviously you could start out from different places. But in terms of solving problems, I think that individualism sometimes.
But you never catch up, Chris. You never catch up. You never catch up by the community. Never catches up unless there's also an addressing of the systemic. That's like saying that we end apartheid, and now all of a sudden, because there's individual capacity, all of the black individuals in South Africa are all of a sudden going to do as well as all of the white individuals. Not the case at all. That's why there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because of the reality that there are still systemic. This Horatio algorithm that we just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps work if everybody's got the same boots and everybody's got the same quality of straps, and they don't.
I agree. I think that this is a good point. I don't know many people who believe that individual agency and this individualism, values, characters, morals, and principles are going to give you the ability to just do whatever you want and rise up past your circumstances. I think the issue comes in where people feel as though the whole idea of individualism on a whole is now seen as white supremacy culture or racist. The African American Museum of History and Culture had that pamphlet on the aspects and assumptions of whiteness in the United States last summer. And one of the things that they said is individualism, meritocracy, things like that were like aspects of whiteness and white supremacy. And I think people feel like that's kind of, they feel as though it's not correct. It's just, they feel as though these things are being marginalized, that these real things like, hard work or making good decisions or having principles and values, it's just discounted and it's put to the point where you're just lost in a system. I think they're the two extremes. I think I agree with you. There needs to be a balance, but on both ends of the spectrum, people feel as though these ideals, these supposedly traditional American ideals are under attack, like individualism and meritocracy as a whole, just like get rid of them. That's what some people do. You see that people feel that way?
Again, I'm not the brightest crayon in the box, so but I'm relatively smart. I've read a little bit, so I understand it and I get it. But there's a breakdown when you really start to peel back the layers in some of these things, because the problem is the quote unquote successful individuals didn't just merit where they are. Most of the time, whatever has been earned, with the help of other people and with the assistance, some,
family, right?
But not just family. I mean, let's talk about
community, schools, education.
Early wealthy families in America. I mean, how did they get their wealth? Off the backs of other people.
Sometimes they did. That's a broad brush.
Okay, you're right. I generalized a little bit, but before the Industrial Revolution, right, most of the wealth had a lot to do with agrarian things, right, and primarily slave labor, tending to those fields. So if you look at it that way, then all of a sudden I begin to understand that this idea and conception of those successful individuals earning and meriting everything that they have is not quite as accurate as it's portrayed to be.
Okay. You're right. Not everything. But again, I think on one hand, people discount the merit and the individualism, and on the other hand, they put too much stock into it. It's not everything, but it's part of it. I think it's a significant part of it.
That's one perspective. I don't know. I don't know if I fully agree with it, but that's certainly one perspective.
Okay. So let's take a look at the next quote that was very, I guess, controversial, and that's what I did the video about. And I'm glad you're going to come on and talk about it. When you said, and I don't want to mangle your quote, but after you listened to the parents and community members speak at the school board meeting on June 14th, you had said something to the effect of, "This is why, after hearing this tonight, now I understand why, or this is why the Capitol was breached. Now I understand why the Capitol was breached on January 6th. Do you think that was a little extreme, or could you just give us more perspective on that part?
Misinformation. Yeah. So was it, how do I say this so that I can be properly quoted going forward? Was there a better way to expound upon that statement? Yes. Would I have not said it? No. I would still say it, but to put it in proper context, misinformation, the perpetuating of misinformation with folks knowing that it's misinformation. So again, right there is no CRT curriculum in our school district. There's an equity initiative, as there is throughout the state of Pennsylvania. I mean, you teach in Philly. Philly does a lot on equity, and sure. I don't know. Do you believe that there's a critical race theory curriculum in Philadelphia schools?
I want to answer that question because it's a really.
But if you I promise you, I'm threading the needle here.
Oh, okay.
Would you say there is?
Would I say there's equity curriculum?
No. Would you say there's a CRT curriculum in Philadelphia schools?
I'd say it's based in critical pedagogy, which is like a finer point. It's semantics.
Okay. Fair enough. So I'll take that as a no. And
it's an offshoot of it.
It's an offshoot of it.
Philly, I like Philly. Dude, you know what? I think Philly's more reasonable than most of the districts, actually. I like Philly's approach.
Okay.
From my experience. So they're not as out there with that stuff as some, they're not as deep in as some places.
And it sits differently because you're in the majority of your student population are students of color. You have a significantly more diversified teaching staff and administrative staff. You know what I mean? Yes, in some cases it's apples and orangutans, but for the most part, it's not. The point that I was making is that equity is not something new. There's whole offices in the state of Pennsylvania throughout the education complex about equity. There are school districts in Podunk, Pennsylvania, some of the most conservative parts of the country, doing equity work. So this notion that because we're doing equity work, we have a CRT curriculum, which we don't, because PEG, for the most part, has nothing to do with our, the scope and sequence in our courses and our program of studies. It's extreme. And there are people that know that, Chris, but still want to hype things up and spread misinformation and get people riled. That's the stuff that divides, not Kyle Boyer addressing hurtful and harmful comments at a school board meeting. Well, let me just finish the statement.
Sure.
The constant spread of misinformation. And as we know, it is a fact. Mr. Trump didn't win the election. Many people voted for him, as was their right, because they believed that he was the best choice for president. But he didn't win the election. And the reason that people breached the Capitol on January 6th, I don't think they're all evil people. I don't think they're all racist. But they did breach the Capitol, I believe, because of the spread of misinformation. And when misinformation is spread in a very harmful way, it does lead to divisive stuff like that. So yes, that's what I meant. Misinformation being spread.
Okay. I could say also that other things happened over the last year that were based on misinformation. When you talk about different situations, there's misinformation and people, go out and protests become, more radical or violent, and sometimes it's misinformation. So I understand, I agree, especially with the media, it's definitely a narrative. Sometimes it is misinformation or they're giving you a slice. But to just come back to that January 6th comment, so you're saying it's because of misinformation. Would you agree that some people would say that comment, that this is why we can understand that the Capitol was breached on January 6th? Could you see how some people would say that comment was a little hurtful and harmful, in a way suggesting or comparing people who were, and a lot of those parents you'd have to agree, were very polite, and they were very they were polite, they were respectful, they were just simply voicing their issues, to kind of say that to those people, to compare them to people who were so-called insurrectionists. Do you feel that could be hurtful and harmful? Even though you're saying it's really just based on misinformation, but your language, could it be seen in the same way that someone who says that they don't believe in systemic racism? Do you think it's kind of like that?
So you began by I began by saying that if I had to do it again, I would have given more context to that statement. It's hard to give full context to everything you want to say. I can understand how someone who I may not have even been addressing may have said that. There were a couple of parents who brought up the fact that, they're still learning, and that they would like to just have more information on how PEG engages the district. I wasn't talking about those parents. I was talking about things like, you're teaching our students racism, what, from Miss Gearlings. Yeah. And if you look at her Facebook post and the kind of things that she shares on Facebook, yes, things like that are why January 6th happened, because of misinformation, the spread of misinformation, the deference to media sources that are okay with misinformation. I don't defer to CNN, MSNBC. I don't defer to any of them. I read, I study, I engage individuals like yourself. What did I do after I saw a YouTube video, like 50 people sharing with me your YouTube video? And I'm like, well, I'm not offended. I make public comments. I don't get on anonymous blogs. I make public comments every week. I'm a preacher. That's what I do. I'm a teacher. I stand up in public and say things that I need to be prepared to defend, that I hope are spoken from an educated and knowledgeable place. So I'm not scared when someone puts out a YouTube video. But what did I do, Chris? I reached out to you and I said, hey, I feel like you didn't play all of my comments. I feel like some of this is taken out of context. Why don't we have what I hope you think has been a civil discussion? So, this notion that that I'm racist against white people is absolutely ridiculous.
I don't believe that.
No, I know you don't. You wouldn't be talking to me like that. And those are some of the things that you hear from people who post anonymously. And even you, to your credit, Chris, you have a YouTube channel where your name is ascribed to things. You say what you say publicly. You stand behind what you say. I don't agree with you on everything, but I respect the fact that you are mature enough to say those things publicly. And unfortunately, a lot of misinformation is spread by people who don't do that. And those are the things that I'm very much against.
Okay. I appreciate that. So if we can go back to the critical race theory, because you did make a good point, and this has become a point of debate and contention over what is really critical race theory, what is, the difference between teaching critical race theory and using critical pedagogy, and then the extension of that, and what is really considered CRT and not. I see your point. You said that CRT, I believe, is not being taught in the district, and technically when you look at it in terms of theoretical critical race theory, it's not being taught. But if you look at it in terms of the critical pedagogy, and I think you even mentioned that as well, there was an extension of some kind of critical pedagogy. What I mean is looking at equity, looking at things in terms of systems, looking at disparities, looking at patterns. But the thing is, and I wonder if you understand this, and you probably do, or you're aware of this, people like Robin DiAngelo and her books, and a lot of times activists come in with this edgy stuff, and that's what gets the attention. When we hear Robin DiAngelo say things like, all whites are inherently racist, I'm not sure how you feel about that. But there are some lessons and activities that have been going on. And I don't know if you follow Christopher Rufo and the reporting of the activities and lessons in certain districts in certain places. Like, for example, the PGW. What could you refresh my memory on the name of the group?
Educational group.
Yes, educational group. Right. I think I was calling it education group. This was reported in a newspaper called The College Fix that years ago they did this activity, and it was called the Color Line, where they brought in either teachers or students, college students, and they had them answer questions and try and score their oppressiveness or their privilege. It was kind of like an identity wheel where they had to identify their privilege or their oppressive nature and add up a score. And then they had to kind of take that score and line up in order of the score. And some people felt it was divisive, and they felt it was, in a way, maybe even humiliating to do it in public. But there's activities like that seem to be polarizing and divisive, where you're labeling entire groups like all whites are systemically racist, all whites are privileged, people of color are kind of caught in a system. And then you have people arguing there's this Marxist flavor to it, oppressors and oppressed, that we're not trying to find these universal connections. It's more of an approach that's polarizing and divisive. Are you aware that exists, that there's some elements of that, and that people are, that's what a lot of times, that's what people feel
elements of that where?
In the United States. I'm not saying specifically in your school district, other than that Pacific educational group, that activity was associated with that group, according to that article, and that group is a consultant in your district.
Yeah. Glenn Singleton, I mean, have you read any of his books?
I haven't read his books. I've read some of the things on his website, but I haven't deeply read his one book. I know.
So one of the things that I've done, and this doesn't necessarily show up on a LinkedIn or something, but I've done trainings for pretty established groups. I'm not going to name them. And an activity like a color line is very powerful. And it depends on how it's used. Would I take a group of students and do that with them, in a class? Probably not, because I don't necessarily know how that translates to curriculum in any course that I can think about per se. There are some. You may be doing a course on, I don't know, race and social. If there's a course on race and social justice or something, but in the beginning of the school year, would I take that and do it with a group of students? No, but for a group of staff who might need to understand better how some of their other colleagues feel or understand some of the privilege they have, yeah.
Okay. Can I ask you this question, and I'm curious to know your answer? When we talk about white privilege, because I believe you had a conversation or a number of conversations with some parents or concerned citizens in your district over white privilege, and this is something we always come back to. There was a really good article written in Teaching Tolerance. I forget the name of the writer, but he broke down white privilege into these 3 different areas, and I thought it was really well done. I actually wrote a book last year. In January, it was published. It was called Exploring White Fragility, Debating the Effects of Whiteness Studies on America's Schools, and I really got into some of this stuff, and I kind of challenged Robin DiAngelo. And I understand the theoretically white privilege, and it's obvious when you look at historical racism and you look at things where you look at the United States and the playing field, things aren't always equal, and things need to be brought into balance. But when we're talking about solutions, not causes, when we're talking about solutions, explain to me from your perspective, how does having white people or students check their privilege or talking about privilege, how does that help? Like, how is that a solution in your mind? Like, what does that do?
Well, for one thing, it makes people aware of what other people are going through. So it makes me less likely to cast aspersions on groups of individuals marching for something like Black Lives Matter. But let's use an example. Are you left-handed or right-handed?
Right-handed.
Right. As am I, which is
Okay.
dominant in society. That's the dominant trait.
Mm-hmm.
But our friends and family members who are left-handed, they have to think about where they sit at dinner tables. They have to think about the kind of scissors that they use. These are things that we don't have to think about. I don't think anyone would argue that that's not a privilege. I don't have to think about it because I'm right-handed. I just grab a pair of scissors that are typically made for me. I use them. I sit somewhere at a dinner table. I'm not worried about bumping elbows with somebody. But it's not the case for someone who is left-handed. And there were some really, really good comments from other individuals, including one student named Anish in our school district who's a rising junior. And I mean, just talking about acknowledging privilege, like right-handed privilege, like heterosexual male privilege that I have. And I don't know how your life, you may have the same. That is not me hating myself. That's me acknowledging, look, I have this privilege. Take sexuality out of it. I'm a male. I have that privilege in society. Females still make 80-something cents to the dollar of what the average male makes. It's just a fact.
I'd have to argue on that point, but I hear what you're saying.
What's your
the 87, the 83 or 87 cents on the dollar? There's other studies that show it's closer to about 97 cents on the dollar.
It's still less than a dollar.
So, but how does that privilege? So that privilege is making people who have privilege aware of the people who don't have the privilege. So it's kind of like a compassion thing. It's making people more compassionate. Is that what it's about?
Address it, it's kind of like that cliche. How do you address an issue until you know that there is one? Once you become aware of your privilege, you're much more empathetic of folks who aren't in the same position. So my awareness of the issue of transgender students and how they feel. When it came time in our school district to a couple of examples. One, getting rid of, daddy-daughter dances, that kind of stuff. I don't know if that's the specific one, but something like that, right? Not everybody has a dad. Maybe they have two moms. When it came time to change that, it's like a no-brainer. Because I understand how that can make someone else feel. And until individuals start to think about how others may feel or what they may have experienced, they don't really empathize. And they're much more reluctant to help to work to make, that sort of more perfect union that we talk about.
Okay, so it's interesting. So if I'm hearing this correctly, it's really about awareness. It's about compassion and empathy and understanding of other groups. So if you see other groups or you see disparities or you see certain things happening, you'll understand that it's because of systemic issues or power hierarchy.
That's a slight oversimplification, but I think you're hitting in general. I think you're hitting at the idea. You're more likely to empathize if you have a greater understanding and appreciation. There's nothing self-hating about saying that, you know what, as a white man, I have a particular privilege. Because when the cop sees you in the car, you're still a white man. You're still a white man. And there's an initial thing. He's less fearful of you right off the bat. Statistically.
Even African-American cops?
Yeah. What is it, the Harvard study? I mean, because of society, the media, etc., there are whole studies, even with little black kids and little white kids, they'll put dolls in front of them. Which doll is the good doll? Which doll is the bad doll? This has all been studied. It's not made up. And one would ask, well, why would the black kid think that the white doll is the good one? And that's because of all the things that society puts on us. It's systemic.
Can I also add this? I really, I went to a Catholic school, so I have a background in some, religion, spiritual. I'm still spiritual. And the idea of being fortunate and being lucky, when I was growing up, my parents would say, we're pretty fortunate, we're lucky. And I definitely feel there's some power in acknowledging the fact that you have blessings from God. You're blessed, you're lucky, you're fortunate. This I was born with a mom and dad and I have health and different things and I'm fortunate and I'm lucky. And it's something you should appreciate. Sometimes I'm not sure when we get too deep into identity, though, why can't we say just in terms of being fortunate and being lucky and being blessed and things like that? Why can't we just say in general that these are the cases? Why do we always have to break it down into these finite identities? If we can teach an underlying value that just transcends identity, race, religion, gender, sexuality, and just say we need to appreciate our fortune, we need to be aware of others who aren't as fortunate, we need to understand that situations are very complex, and people don't always have the the fortune that you have. Why can't we make it more of a universal value instead of dressing it up in identity? Because when you do qualify it and you say white and things like that, it starts to become, sometimes it's almost counterproductive, because then people stop listening and then people get defensive and then sometimes it causes resentment. And I think, well, if we were just more open, when we say universal, like colorblind, I know the new push is colorblindness is now colorblind racism. And I get it that you can't ignore color, you can't ignore patterns and disparities. But why can't we just acknowledge our color, celebrate our differences and our identities, and then move past it to a more universal understanding? Like if we all came together, because I know when we talk about universal values, people say it's culturally relative to, it might be white supremacy values. But if we all came together and said, these are our values as Americans or whatever, these are our principles, can't we come from a place from there instead of qualifying it always through identity? What about that approach?
The problem is because our values play out in terms of identity. Our values disproportionately negatively affect certain folks due to identity. That's the problem. And again, I'm not making this up. The data bears that out. If I want to buy a Ford car, I don't ask what plant, what manufacturing plant, which city my Ford car was made in. But if you know that all of the cars from a particular plant have a defect, you don't say to the customer, that stinks that you just happened to buy that one from Detroit. You fix it. You address the defect in the system so that all of the products, everybody gets lifted. And I think that's what many of us believe as it relates to systemic injustice. And no, there's not just oppression based on race, but the problem in America is that because of our history, we're uncomfortable with race. So as soon as there's meaningful racial progress in our country, the history is that we deflect to something else. We change the conversation. There's another issue. There's the oppression Olympics, and it's like, well, what about this group? And yeah, I was oppressed as well. And it's like, yeah, but your issue isn't the topic of conversation right now. It's the same thing with Black Lives Matter. It's like, yes, but that's not what we're talking about right now. Let's deal with the racial injustice. Let's have that conversation, and we'll give other conversations their time. But right now we're talking about this and dealing with this.
Okay. So just to follow up on that, let's just say I was taught and I was, educated, and I learned, maybe I went to a workshop, or I just, learned to be really empathetic, really compassionate, really open, tolerant, and I had these basic values. Would I be able at that point to no longer see color? Would it matter at that point?
Everybody sees color. You don't look at
what I mean by moving past it, meaning moving past it and looking at things on an underlying level in terms of universal, not identity. Would I be able to move past identity?
I don't want to. No, you can't, because of the way society is designed. You literally see color. It's just a reality. Everybody sees color. I don't see color. Yeah, you do. You look at an individual. I'm not talking about you. I'm saying, a think aloud here. When people say I don't see color, yes, they do.
I agree that we see color, but do you agree that at a certain point we no longer see the identity and we move past it? Let me just give you a quick example. I'm a track coach in Philadelphia, and there's been times, this is the truth, there's been times where, especially indoor track, girls track meets, we have to get on a school bus. We got to go up to Lehigh University, and we have to go to these meets.
I ran indoor track as well.
Okay, great. I ran indoor too. I grew up in the system. I
only ran 1 year. I did spring track all 4 years, but I went up to Lehigh 1 year.
Awesome. So every once in a while, this will happen to me. I'm on the bus. We're 45 minutes into the ride. I'm talking to other coaches, and I'm interacting and talking to some of the kids and my athletes. And then I'll look around and I'll say, am I the only white person on the bus? Like, honestly, it happened a couple of times. And I'm like, okay, And the thing is, it's like I didn't even realize that. Like it's not that I said I didn't realize it until it was like, okay, because I knew everybody already. I knew the coaches, I knew the kids, and then it's like, oh man, I'm the only white person on the bus. So in a way, I didn't see the identity. Do you understand what I'm saying in that case? Or do you deny
I
that?
do,
Reality?
and I understand the point. I understand the point that you're making, but you acknowledged it, and I mean, you just laying the facts out. You have written a book that deals with race, so even you, in all of your comfort with people of color and your students, and I'm sure you have phenomenal relationships. I'm sure when they graduate, they write back to you and all of that good stuff. No doubt about it, right? You're not a racist. You're a great guy, but that doesn't change, again, the system. And I get it. There are people of different schools of thought, but there is a system, and the system still affects certain individuals in negative ways. And in the school district of Philadelphia, I mean, the outcomes of a whole school district tell that tale. There are people, just waxing educational policy for a second. There are people in the central part of the state, people in power, people in political positions that, due to race, treat a place like Philadelphia a certain kind of way, not knowing that they work against their own self-interest in their part of the state. It's ridiculous. And it's not because Philadelphia is miles away from them. It's because Philadelphia is primarily folks of color. It's unfortunate, but the outcomes of even your school district tell the tale of systemic injustice.
Okay. How much of that do you believe is done overtly and consciously, or is it just a system thing? Like in terms of kind of, you know what I'm saying? Is it just a system thing, or do you think that people are consciously, that's a conscious thing? There's
some unconscious, of course, but there's also a lot of overt. I mean, in education policy in particular, there's a reason that majority of the charter schools in the state of Philadelphia, Lord Jesus, in the state of Pennsylvania, in the city of Philadelphia, right? Where are charter schools pushed? They're pushed in communities of color. They didn't start that way. When they started in the Midwest, they were started as sort of bastions of innovation. But over time, if your goal is to not support public education, primarily for students of color, then what's one entity that can do that? You introduce these sort of market reforms into education, and who's affected? Again, it's people of color. So it's in many systems. Education and criminal justice, I think, are just sort of at the top of the list, but it's not just education and system. Education and criminal justice. It's healthcare. It is foreign policy, looking at what's happened to Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, a country full of Black people.
Okay, I'm really appreciate you're generous with your time. So we're coming on an hour. I just have one final question, since you were bringing up charter schools. Just I figured I would throw it in there. In terms of school choice and what you can see and what you know of the charters in the state, and
I started my career in charter schools, by the way.
Okay, how do you feel about that on that whole issue?
I'm not opposed to charter schools, but and this is my line, I'm not just saying this for today, but I have big problems with the charter school system because it takes money away from public schools. We know that. It's not made up. We know that. That's why in a place like Tredyffrin, Easttown, you don't have people running the charter schools.
That is interesting.
What do you mean that's interesting? Unpack that statement.
Because I think it's complex. I think in the neighborhoods where you would need charters, or where parents, because charters go where the parents want them in certain cases. If the parents don't want the charters and there's no demand for the charters, they're not going to survive. People are getting on waiting lists to go to charters, and I think above instructional rigor, I think it's about safety in certain situations.
It's definitely about safety. That's been proven.
Yeah.
It's about safety much more than educational outcomes.
Yeah.
For parents, it's about safety. For supposed legislators and the market reformers that push it, it's about outcomes. But the outcomes don't match up with what they're purported to be. Charter schools don't perform any better than public schools en masse. And the other issue is that it's sort of a created problem. If you continue to drain a public school entity of financial resources, of course it's going to get worse. And what happens when it gets worse? Parents are looking for the alternative. So this entity over here that can, automatically increase its funding, parents are going to look to that. It's a created problem.
I talked about charter schools, debated about charter schools for a long time, and my position kind of evolved. But I see, again, I'm kind of like the middle way type of person. I can see the good in them. I can also see how it can become, when you're taking money out of neighborhood schools and some charter schools aren't as good, and you need a balance and you need to have regulation. But I think there should be some choice there. And I think it helps. It makes it more competitive. And
But
I think
folks like me, Chris, see the racialized element to it. And I know that offends some people, many of your viewers, because I saw their comments, their nice comments on your last video. Many of your viewers are going to take issue with me saying that. But when you start to ask them certain questions, how would you feel if you had a black child? Would you trade your position as a white individual for a black individual? You know what I mean? And then also, let's be honest, there's conversations that aren't public. The conversation is different. We saw that with the ESPN reporter the other day with Rachel Nichols. I think.
Yeah, I remember seeing something.
Right. So basically, she felt like ESPN
was giving her job away because of race.
Was given an opportunity away because of race.
Yeah.
And the conversation was different. It was a private conversation, which I acknowledge. She has every right to have a private conversation. But it did prove the point for a lot of people of color like myself who understand the conversation is different when we're not in the room.
And I think that it's that way for everyone too, as well. Of all races.
Same thing with men and women, right?
Sure.
Different when there's not a woman.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. That's interesting. I have one more question. Are you good on time, or do
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I appreciate that. One of the things that's also brought up, it's like a hot button thing, is the microaggression, the microaggressions and implicit biases. Okay, and I can't remember if you specifically mentioned microaggressions were brought up.
I used the term microaggression.
Okay, I've seen it mentioned at school board meetings. But when I wrote this book, I did some research on microaggressions and the science behind it. There was a psychology professor from Emory University, Scott Linenfeld, and he studied all the literature on microaggressions in 2017, and he kind of concluded that it's not completely conclusive. It's not totally accurate. This term microaggression is not settled science. But I'm curious, in terms of your opinion, when we talk about microaggressions, the way that I feel when we're talking about communication is, there's a person who's making a comment, there's the person who is making the statement, and then there's the receiver. And what happens in between is like a co-creation. So I'm saying something, you're receiving it, the two of us are kind of co-creating this meaning. Do you agree with that? That when we're having a conversation, the way you receive it has an effect on what was said? Or do you believe that what is said is just that's just the way it is? It doesn't matter what you intended. So if you say something in the wrong way, it doesn't matter how you receive it. It's still a microaggression. Like, what is your take on that?
The problem, I think, with what you said is that if we operate under the assumption that when people say something, they're revealing a certain aspect of their beliefs and mindsets, then yes, it becomes very clear what microaggressions are. Can I utilize an example from the school board meeting?
Sure.
So Barbara Ellis was the individual who got up and started by saying, my first best friend was a little black girl, which, if you could see, I mean, even some of the people on the, anti-equity work side are like, oh boy, because in your mind, I'm sure even you, if you heard somebody get up and start by saying, my first friend was a black girl, that's kind of like textbook. You don't say, but I have black friends, to defend yourself not being, I don't know that Barbara Ellis is a racist, but to defend yourself not being prejudiced or something like that. She goes on to talk about, we're making the black community lazy, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but to a black person sitting at the table there, yeah, microaggression.
So it was revealing something in her, kind of underneath that.
It was revealing her belief that we're making the Black community lazy.
How she really feels. That's kind of what it's really all about.
Let's just take her words at face value. It was revealing what she thought, that we're making the Black community lazy with all of these handouts since the time of LBJ.
Do you I do remember that part.
Would you agree her comment?
The handouts, the language of handouts, I kind of heard that, and I thought that was definitely that could. Yeah, I heard that part, and I would agree that was. You could see that was poor choice of words. You know what I mean? You could see it could have offended some people. Okay, it's interesting because there were some people who had some polite, good things to say, and different things could have been, seen as edgy, because everybody has their perspective, and it's I agree. Do you think that the idea of microaggressions sometimes do you think that this idea is abused in terms of stating or claiming microaggressions, and because it's so vague and it's hard to really understand at that subconscious or unconscious level, do you think people say this was a microaggression when maybe it was received in the wrong way? Do you think that that's possible? Do you think that's problematic?
Absolutely. I don't know that I agree that it's abused more often than not. I don't know if I agree with that, but is it abused? Absolutely.
Okay.
I don't sit and look at my phone and watch videos and say, you know what, every Black person that gets up and claims racism or claims injustice is automatically right without critically assessing. I don't do that. And I would venture to say most of the people in my circle don't do that. Most of the people that I know, most of the people of color that I know that fight for social justice don't do that. Everything deserves to be vetted and critically analyzed and approached with suspicion. And yeah, there are times when someone claims that was a microaggression. I'll give you an example. Sha'Carri Richardson. Every time I'm asked about whether or not I think that there was, an injustice carried against her, not because she was Black. She tested positive for a substance that she shouldn't have. Those were the rules. Is it unfortunate that her mother passed? Absolutely. I think her circle of trainers, the U.S. track team, etc., her close friends, they should have protected her a little bit more. Your mother would want you to run, and it's hard, but you can't engage in this. But that's not because she was Black. That's because that rule was that. Now, on the other side, the haircut ban, clearly racial undertones to that.
Okay.
The no protesting thing. Well, they said, are you aware of that?
Say that one more time.
So at the basically political demonstration of any kind at the Olympics was banned after the Olympic Committee polled a significant number of athletes. The reality, though, is majority of athletes still come from the Western world, and the Western world in general still deals with issues of race. So yes, people are going to be voting in a way that would prevent folks from political expression.
I hear what you're saying, and I know the American Olympic Committee, in terms of the American Olympic trials, they did allow certain protests in certain situations, but the actual International Olympic Committee,
banned it.
Right. But I actually did a video about that. I was interested, and the one thing though that I would say as an opposition to what you said, or a counterpoint to that, is the Olympics, to me, or at least it seemed the way that the Olympics developed, it was a 2-week period where you kind of put down your arms, you put down your politics, you put down your policies, and you just came together and you were just going to compete on this kind of universal level in terms of, we're going to make it just about the sport, we're going to make it just about competition. We're going to, for these 2 weeks, we're going to put down our differences, our arms, our politics, and just make it this kind of honest, open athletic competition. And that when you bring in your politics, especially, you can do it because there's certain rules. You can do it outside the village. You can do it in different press conferences. But when you're on the medal stand or you're inside the arena, you don't bring in your politics. You just make it this honest athletic competition. From that perspective, I can see how if that was the idea and that was the spirit of the Olympics, I think I might agree with that, because we do have politics that are, in America, in the world today, politics are 24/7. They're everywhere. And then for 2 weeks during the year, internationally, everybody comes together, puts aside politics in their arms, and we just have an honest athletic competition. What do you think about that perspective of the Olympics?
I understand that perspective. I feel like this is the theme of our conversation tonight. I understand it. I disagree with it, though.
Okay.
It's the same reason that why does Colin Kaepernick take a knee? Because that's a platform to raise awareness for the issue. So if you're on the world stage and there is a systemic issue in your country that you're trying to raise awareness about, why wouldn't you use the world stage to raise awareness of it? If the Olympics, conversely, if we take an alternative viewpoint, if the Olympics are about the betterment of humanity through sports, bringing us all to making us a better world through sports, which some could argue that it is, then helping to raise issues of injustice in particular parts of that world would be a very appropriate thing for the Olympics. If there was something going on in Djibouti, and the Olympic team from Djibouti raised awareness about it, I would be glad that they did. So I know, this is what's happening in Djibouti, and the rest of the world can rally to help address it. But here's the comedy about how a lot of people talk about protests now. We're in a nation that was, what is very much a part of the history of our nation, being founded upon protests. No taxation without representation. What was that? That was a protest. Throwing all of this tea in Boston Harbor was not, this act of decorum and this grand act of civility. It was an act of protest. So the idea that peaceful protest is somehow offensive, I understand when people are upset about violent protest, which has been the rarity, by the way. I understand that for sure, because I don't engage in violence. But at the same time, it's ridiculous to me that people sort of automatically cast aspersions against what are mostly peaceful protests, because it's protest. I don't get that.
Interesting. Well, it's about an hour and 15 minutes in, so I really appreciate the conversation. It's funny how time just goes by when you get into a good conversation. So I'm going to just wrap it up. I know you're a busy man, and I appreciate again that you made time to come onto the, to the channel. And I'm glad you reached out to me. I did the video. You're right. I couldn't fit the whole thing in there, the whole 16 minutes of your kind of, your sermon, which I could see your training. And the fact that you're a pastor, I appreciated that.
It wasn't a sermon, but I understand the characterization.
Okay, but I'm glad you came on, and I appreciate it, and I hope that you feel as though you were able to, give your broader, articulate your points, and I hope the people that watch will better understand what was said at the school board meeting. But just having the conversation is a good thing, because it's good to hear other perspectives. It's good to talk. And I really appreciate it. So I just want to thank you, and wish you good luck and everything, in the future. And thanks for coming on.
Likewise, thanks for the opportunity, Chris. And yes, definitely feel like I was treated fairly. I look forward to seeing all the nice comments.
Yeah. All right. And when I put it up, I'll definitely send you a link. And I think it'll be pretty civil, but we'll see. It usually is. All right.
Thanks, man.
Okay, thanks.